Disclaimer. Judge Ron Rangel is providing this podcast and website for educational purposes only, as well as to give the public general information regarding topics related to the criminal justice system. The views, thoughts, and opinions of his guest speakers are the speaker's own and do not represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of Judge Rangel. All rise. You are now listening to Beyond the Gavel with Judge Ron Rangel, educating the public and expanding mindsets. Subscribe on our website, beyondthegavelpodcast.com, or your favorite podcast platform for more of the latest podcast episodes and updates.
Welcome to Beyond the Gavel with Judge Ron Rangel. I am your host. This is part 2 of my interview with Jason Goss. I enjoyed speaking to him so much, I simply could not stop the conversation. Let's head back into the show. So let's kind of analyze this for a second. So what you're doing is you're thinking it would be some sort of an injustice for this mandatory parole release date to come. She gets released. She'll be out in the free. You have all of these families that have children who have been murdered. There's been ample evidence from what you could tell looking at these bankers' boxes that Genene Jones is responsible. There was a lot of stuff going on. The concern was, we need to do something from keeping her from being released. And I remember turning on the news at that time. This is before I went to the series and the TV shows. I actually have the TV on the regular channels that we're used to. And they were talking about this. So y'all had some sort of a clock to work on. Yeah. Right. So you had to reopen up this investigation. What was that process like?
Well, so I ended up taking the boxes. I asked Nico I said, I need a room to put these in. And so he did. He gave me a room. He said, all right, that's going to be the room. And we filled the room up wall to wall. And I said, I need whiteboards on every wall. And so Nico's at DA's office ordered whiteboards for every wall.
This is your baby.
Yeah.
This is your case.
And so we started figuring out, okay, so for Joshua Sawyer, for instance, so Joshua Sawyer was 1 year old in 1981 when he came into the hospital, and the house that he was in had caught fire, and they got him out, but he had smoke inhalation. What they found is that every time Genene Jones was working the 3 to 11 shift, and every time on 3 to 11, he would code blue, which means that he would stop breathing or he would have a major medical emergency that could be life and death. And then they would stabilize him. And then Genene Jones would go home at 11. And then so from 11 to 7, the next morning, he's fine. From 7 to 3, during the morning and afternoon, he's fine. Genene Jones would get back to the 3 to 11 and he would code again. And the way he would code is his heart would start, it would be tachycardia, which would start beating very, very fast. And then it would be what's called a systole, which is when you see on TV, when it's like somebody's on a heart monitor, it's like beep, 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 the flat line. The systole, the medical term is a systole. And so he would have a systole and they would clear, and everybody would be around him and she would be around him, because that's part of that's her whole pathology, is she'd want to be around him to try to save him too.
And Joshua Sawyer was under a year old at this time.
Yeah, he's 11 months old when he came in, and it's just a baby, and a sweet baby. Like he looked kind of like my son now is too, but a sweet baby. And so what they determined was, and it all just kind of fell into place. We had his mother who had kept his records for all these years, and she told me, she said, every year that I looked at these records and I tried to find something, but I didn't know what they meant. And so I would just take them out every year and just look and see it, because I know that woman killed my baby. And so, but she had them, and that was great, because what the record showed us was there was a car. When he died, he was in code during Genene Jones's shift. She was right around the bed. And when he died, one of the doctors had said, as he was coding, was saying, like, get his blood to the lab, like try to figure out what's going on inside. So what happened was they drew his blood, they took it to the lab. The lab takes a while. By the time that the lab came out with their result, Joshua had died. And then they just take him down to the morgue, and then nobody looked at the lab, because they don't need it. It's a dead child now.
So by the time you have this case, are these hospital records still available?
It's the ones that the mother had because they had shredded everything. University shredded everything after they got.
The hospital didn't have anything.
Mm-hmm.
It's everything that the mother kept from the civil case.
Yeah, for the civil case. So just her file, which we put in a safe immediately and locked it up because, it was worth that much to us. Mm-hmm. But in the records was that lab. And what the lab showed, so Dilantin, he was on Dilantin because of the smoke inhalation. Dilantin is an anti-seizure medication. Mm-hmm. It helps you to not have seizures. And so he was getting, and you could see from the records that he was getting regular, nice doses that he's supposed to have to make sure he doesn't have seizures. So a normal level for Dilantin is like 12 to 17. That's the number. Like, so if you think like every time they check for Dilantin in his blood, it should be 12 to 17 is kind of in your normal range. His last one when he coded was 60. So you knew that you could tell. And we had doctors and I had grand jury testimony because they had brought the doctors in. Mm-hmm. And the doctors said, well, yeah, he just, he just died. He da-da-da. And they said, well, what about this Dilantin level? And the doctors go, well, that's impossible. Uh-huh. And they go, no, that's what his Dilantin level is. And they said, well, if his Dilantin level was that, then that just says that his liver is not metabolizing Dilantin. Mm-hmm. And they go, okay, look at this record. What is his liver? Is his liver okay? And they said, oh, yeah, his liver's great. Mm-hmm. So it's not his liver. And then I ended up asking our expert who was going to testify at the trial if we needed it, was like, if you took his liver completely out, would that, if he didn't even have a liver, would it get to 60? And they said, absolutely not. Mm-hmm. I said, how is the only way it could get to 60? And they said, you'd have to take a full syringe and you'd have to inject it as fast as possible because Dilantin has to be injected very slowly. So your whole dose would go over like a 2-minute period. Mm-hmm. But if you do a bolus is what they call it, where you just slam down on that plunger. Mm-hmm. If you do that bolus, then your heart starts beating fast and then flattens out, and then you stop breathing, and then all these other things happen.
Now, it's an anti-seizure medication, right? Mm-hmm. And was that something that was given to infants, children under the age of 1?
It was back then for children in his condition, which he had brain swelling because of the smoke inhalation and the fire. Yeah. And so it was back then. But he was expected to live. I mean, and we don't know what his brain was functioning, but he may have had issues, but he was expected to live and he would have lived, by all accounts, like a good life, a healthy life with his mother. Now they would not necessarily use Dilantin. Dilantin was kind of an old school thing that they used back in the 80s. There are other drugs that they would use now that's different and nothing related to this. It's just, medical improvements.
So part of the prosecution then with Genene Jones in this case, the Sawyer cases, you had to prove that the child would have lived. Mm-hmm. Because the murder had to have been the reason for this child's death.
Right. Yep.
Was that a difficult thing for you to?
The best thing that we had was how well he was doing when she wasn't there. You take a 24-hour day. And so, the 3 to 11 shift is 8 hours. So for 16 of the 24 hours, he's fine. No problems, no issues. He does have issues, but he's going to live. Right. I mean, and all the doctors would have said that. They said, there's no reason we would have expected this child to die. It's the Dilantin and everything else. And, a lot of people said, well, how do you know it's Genene? And here's the advantage that we had that they didn't have in the past. Mm-hmm. I had a conviction of her as a baby murderer. Mm-hmm. So as you know, and if I were in your court, I would have gone in front of you and said, look, if they're contesting identity, 404B and the rules of evidence allow me to say, if we're wondering who murdered a baby on the floor, we can look and see was there a convicted baby murderer that was taking care of him. And that can establish her identity as the person who did it. Because of all the other people, she's the one with the MO. She's the one with the modus operandi. This is the way she does things. So we could have proven that. And I think most judges in that situation would have allowed it because the murder, it was established he was killed by somebody. There was no way that an 11-month-old could have that much Dilantin injected into him without a human being doing it to him.
Right.
It's not an accident. And so the murder's established. And so then it's just who is the murderer. And what we had is that we have a convicted murderer who murders babies just like this and did it to Chelsea and did it to others and, and obviously did it to Joshua. That's the one thing that I think that was different with the way I did it, because a lot of the prosecutors that I talked to before, they kept this tunnel vision about well, we can't really prove that. And I said, no, there's all these rules of evidence that say that's exactly how you do it.
Right.
That's what it's for, is to just say, look, if identity is an issue, how do you prove identity? You show that she's done it before, and this is her MO.
Mm-hmm.
So we were definitely counting on that. And it's kind of funny because the case law we were going to use is Genene Jones versus State, because they already established back when Ray was trying it, they already established, because Ray did that too. Like he basically said, look, we know that she was the one that gave heparin to Rolando Santos because she's the one that killed Chelsea. And she's the one that caused all this problem with these other babies. So there was actually a case that we would have used, and we would have cited Genene Jones versus State in State versus Genene Jones to say that we could have done that.
So you got this case indicted?
Yeah. So with Nico, and he always said, and then in the meantime, Jay Norton, who was a longtime defense attorney, had come over to the office, and I was so glad to have him because he has so much experience, and so he came over, and so was me and Jay, and then we were under Nico, and so Jay was having children at the time that this was going on, and so he actually had a visceral memory of like, we have to avoid Bexar County Hospital because there's a woman there killing the babies.
Right.
But Jay, once we did that, and I had Joshua, and I said, I got it. And the kind of cherry on top was that we had this lab report for the dilantin at 60. And I was like, okay, well, how do we prove that? How do we get it? And it was a guy named Dr. Farinacci. He wasn't a doctor at the time. He was actually he was just a lab tech, not just a lab tech, but he was a lab tech at the time. Now he's a dentist in shirts. So I called him and I said, hey, do you remember this? And he came to the office and he goes, that's my writing. And I remember doing this because I was so shocked that it was 60 that I had to like do the calculations again. And so he actually wrote on the test slip that showed that the dilatant was 60. I said, could you sign this right now saying that you've reviewed this and that this is the same test that you did and you can recognize it? He said, absolutely. So once we had that piece go and it fell into place, we had one more issue where we went to Houston because the guy who used to have the hospital, he was the old custodian of records for the hospital. We had a schedule book that showed all the nurses and when they were scheduled and what beds they were scheduled on. And so the book showed that she was the nurse scheduled for Joshua Sawyer on that day, the day that he died, and the other days that he coded. So we went all the way to Houston and brought that book, and we had him look through it, and I had him sign it as a custodian of records, saying I was the custodian of records, and this, all of those things. Like, so we got it all into place. And Nico had said, what he had told me was, he said, I'm not giving anybody false hope. I need to know that you got it. And so I came into Nico's office and I said, boss, we got it. And he goes, you got it? I said, we got it. And he said, let me see. And I showed him the PowerPoint that I would later present to the grand jury. And after he went through it, he goes, y'all got it. He knew it. You could just tell once it's all fit into place that she's the one. And that's when we brought it to the grand jury. And then we brought Petty McClellan, who was the mother of Chelsea, who was murdered. I called her, and that phone call, that was the greatest phone call because she didn't know anything about anything we were doing. And so I called her. I was in my apartment at the time that I used to live right across from here from the courthouse. I was in my apartment and I called her and I said, Petty, this is Jason Goss. I'm a prosecutor in Bexar County. And, I want to talk to you about Genene Jones. And she has, this has been 30 years that she's been fighting and been going to parole hearings and trying to get exposure for all these kids in San Antonio. And so she was like, well, what are you going to tell me? And she was very she wasn't necessarily open. And I said, I just want you to know that I've been going through it and we have a case and we're going to present it to grand jury. And I need you to come testify about what happened to your daughter to the grand jury. And the only sound she made, she goes, oh, and that's all I heard for like a minute
on the phone.
Yeah. I just heard.
Right.
And then it was the floodgates. She just sobbed.
Yeah.
Are you serious? Is this really happening? So it's happened.
And at this time, the media is talking about Genene Jones.
Yeah, and there had been, mainly based on her, because she and Andy Kahn, who was a guy who's a victim advocate out in Houston, where she was living at the time, she just they were stirring it up because they were saying basically like let's do something. She was kind of responsible for when Nico was running. There were questions that were posed to him at these forums and things, and Nico true to his word. He said, I'll look into it. He said, I can't promise. I don't know what, I'm not there yet. I don't know, but I get elected. I'll look into it. And he did. We talked about it. I talked to Nico today about it. And, Nico said, if God put me to be DA to do this case, he said, I'm fine with that because, and for me, it's the thing that I'm most proud of that I said, that I've done career wise.
Right.
But, with Petty, we brought her down to testify to the grand jury. Right. And because I wanted to establish to the grand jury who this person was. And Petty told the whole story. Petty was holding her daughter when Genene injected her. Right. So she watched her daughter stop breathing because remember, she got a paralytic at the suctional choline, which paralyzed her daughter. So her daughter just, she said she like could see her eyes and she tried to say mama and she couldn't. Mm-hmm. And she just stopped breathing in her arms. And so they rushed her to the hospital and, she died. Mm-hmm. And Petty told that story to the grand jury. Mm-hmm. Not a dry eye in that room. I mean, they were just locked in on her. And we also had another person, Rosemary Cantu, whose daughter, Rosemary Vega, was 2 years old. Had a little she had a minor kind of surgery on her heart. It was like a heart band that they needed to kind of repair, like a ventral septal defect. It's like, a little hole in the heart, but totally expected to be fine. She was given something we don't know, but Rosemary was 17 years old and she worked in the hospital. And so she knew Genene Jones, and she was sitting in the room, and Genene Jones came in and she saw her injecting her with something, and then she coded right there. So we had Rosemary come in and testify to the grand jury that what she witnessed. And when we came out, and I presented the rest. I presented Sawyer. I presented Joshua, and I talked about, this is the Joshua Sawyer case. Now that you have that background, here's all the stuff, and here's how it kind of connects. When we came out, and Petty was out there, and Rosemary, and we started saying like, well, okay, we have to leave, and they get to deliberate, and then they're going to come out and tell us, what they think. Mm-hmm. And I mean, basically, I'm saying we have to leave, and they'll start deliberating, and there's a knock, and it's the grand jury, and they said, indict, and they all rushed out of the room and they all started hugging Petty. And it was like, I've never seen anything like it. I was like, man, this is like, that they were so affected. And because these are our people, our babies, our people are, and that was a grand jury saying like, ugh.
Oh, I'm sure that emotion was absolutely raw. And when we're talking about grand jury indictments, there's elements that the state has to prove when you take it to trial. So these indictments don't deal with motive, right? These indictments don't have to prove when you're dealing with the grand jury why somebody did something. When you get to court, you don't necessarily have to prove the why. You just have to prove that this person intentionally, knowingly committed this particular act, which then caused the death of an individual. Mm-hmm. So we ask ourselves why. I mean, what would possess somebody like Genene Jones, who is in the care and custody of children as a pediatric nurse, to do something like this?
Yeah, and that's like, there's been so many different theories. And so I kind of have the advantage of, I've spoken to Genene's sister. I've spoken to her fiance. Genene had 2 children. She had a boy and a girl. Mm-hmm. I've spoken to like other people who have covered her and spoken with her. And, because I haven't obviously had any conversation with her, but the ones who know have been consistent. And they have said that with Genene, the idea was she was a kind of a caustic personality. She was very aggressive. She believed that she knew the right thing and everybody else was stupid. These doctors are stupid. They don't know anything. And she also believed that she was not being recognized for how smart and how good that she was. One of the things that all the nurses did say, though, was like they said she could put an IV in a fly. Like she was really good with like thread and needle and like doing all this stuff. And she was like good at certain things, but she thought she was great. And so one of the kind of consistent things that they talk about is that she wanted to show the best way to I guess to be the hero is to save the child. And one of the ways that she did it in a medical scenario, like in a medical area, is that she would administer the poison and then suggest the antidote. So that because the doctors are coming in, they have no idea why this child is doing this, because none of them believe that there would ever be anybody capable of doing something like this to children that worked as a nurse, so they never even suspected foul play at the beginning. They later did, but at the beginning they didn't. But what she would do is she'd go, okay, give them the poison, and then now I'm going to give them the cure, or suggest to the doctor, well, have you tried this, or have you given this, or haven't done this, or whatever? And the doctor goes, wow, that worked. And this nurse is amazing. And she would do that in order to kind of up herself and make her look better to the doctors and to the other people in the medical community. And what I've compared it to is like if you had a teacher that had a bunch of kids at the Grand Canyon and then she wanted to kind of bump a few to kind of almost go over the edge, but then she grabs him by the arm. And so everybody says, oh, that's a hero. Like, look at her. She saved that kid. But the problem is you miss the arm sometimes and they fall down to the bottom and they die. But for her, it didn't deter her. It was like a compulsion. And, she'd miss one and, oh, oops, died. And then she'd just go to the next one. A lot of them didn't die, that she was hurting. And nobody ever knows that, these parents of these children and the children themselves don't ever know that they were being manipulated like that and being injected with these drugs and coding and all that other stuff. But
sort of like a Munchausen syndrome.
Yep.
Yeah,
exactly. In Munchausen, like one of the things like Munchausen by proxy, because she actually had Munchausen by proxy because like she would make her kids sick to go to the doctor's offices and do all of those things. And there's evidence that she would do that.
Mm-hmm. Her own children. And then she had Munchausen's herself. So Munchausen syndrome is like when you fake sick to get attention. Right.
Munchausen by proxy is when you make other, your children or people close to you sick so you can get attention. And then what she was doing with these babies was like a psychopathic extension of that to a degree that, it's heartbreaking because like she had this access and she had this ability to do this and wasn't checked. And even when she was found out, and they got her. They were so worried about their own stuff, because at the time this was when Bexar County Hospital was trying to transition into University Hospital. And so they did not want any kind of stink like a nurse is killing babies on our floor to mess up that merger and to do any of that. And so, those administrators at the time, in a lot of the notes that we reviewed, those administrators at the time, the line prosecutors at the DA's office at the time said they need to be prosecuted too. Mm-hmm. And they recommended prosecution for the administrators of the hospital for hiding the fact that Genene Jones was killing these babies. Mm-hmm. Mr. Millsap, the DA at the time, ultimately decided not to, and maybe there's a lot of reasons for that. I think some of it is like, if you knock down your Bexar County Hospital, you don't have one anymore, but if you take out, because they were even suggesting prosecuting the hospital itself criminally, which the solution is not to put a hospital in prison, it's to dissolve the hospital altogether. Right. And so, there was a lot of decisions that were made that, I can't second guess now, but they are hard to understand sometimes that why some of these administrators that when you look at these records, they were so knowledgeable that this was happening and who it was doing it. And they made a decision to cover it up.
Mm-hmm. That seemed pretty clear to y'all.
Yes.
So kind of looking back now, so your case has been indicted. It's been assigned in a court at this time?
Yes, it goes to the 399th. Judge Frank Castro was the judge that it got indicted into. And so...
When was this now?
This would have been the first indictments, I think, were in May of 2017. Uh-huh. And then we ended up indicting 4 more after Joshua Sawyer. Uh-huh. Rosemary Cantu, Rosemary Vega, who is Rosemary Cantu's daughter, uh-huh. She got indicted. And then a kid, Ricky Nelson, who was, uh-huh. he was sad because his parents had died before the indictment. So he didn't have anybody, that he was the only person that didn't have a family member that we talked to.
Right.
Paul Villarreal was one of the other ones who was, he was a heparin baby, and he was within like 2 weeks of Rolando Santos, uh-huh. but he died. He was one of the ones that fell off the cliff. Uh-huh. Rolando got saved because he had Dr. Copeland watching over him and taking him off the floor and giving him the antidote. But Paul was probably, I think he was like 3 months old. So
was there another child named Patrick Zavala?
Patrick Zavala as well.
Uh-huh.
So Patrick and Rosemary, we had evidence that it was Genene, but we didn't know exactly what it was that she used, mm-hmm. Because like I said, a lot of those records were gone.
Mm-hmm. But you guys were successful in getting all those indictments?
Yes, because the grand jury, like what, and you'd have to go back like into the records and how, but with Rosemary, we had her mother who actually saw her being injected. Mm-hmm. With Patrick, he was actually exhumed. Like they went and like dug him and Paul back up mm-hmm. after they had buried him, mm-hmm. Which was horrifying for the parents, just, it was terrible. And they were, because what they suspected that those were the first uses of suctional choline, but the babies had been so deteriorated. I mean, they had basically they had been, the way that babies are buried is they're kind of buried in cloth and buried in a wood coffin, and it's not the same. It doesn't keep out everything the same, and so they didn't have like the thighs like they had for Chelsea, that they could get those injection sites, which is where they kind of thought that she must have done it. But there was a lot of other evidence around them, and Paul was clear because all of his was blood out his nose, mouth, everything else. Paul and Rolando Santos looked the exact same. And Paul was always on Genene Jones's shift. It was always the 3 to 11, the death shift, as the nurses started calling it. They called her the death nurse, and they called it the death shift. And, and that's how we know that the hospital was well aware of that. I mean, the nurses, who are also heroes, I mean, they did everything that they could because they noticed this, and they complained to everybody. They complained to the nurse administrators. They went to the hospital administrators. They said, there is a woman and she is killing these babies and she's hurting these babies. So they were saying things.
Well, can you imagine what that must be like, right? They must have gone through.
Oh yeah, no, and we talked to a lot of them, and they're still like heartbroken because anytime you're in that situation, they always think, well, yeah, I should have gone to the police.
What could I have done?
Yeah, but at the time you think, if I tell this supervisor, they're going to do something about it.
It's a hospital.
Yeah. And you think, well, if I go call the cops on my own hospital, then I'm not going to have a job. And, there's just all kinds of stuff. But the situation, it was just so, it's like your brain had to like flip around because everybody who worked in the medical field would just never believe that anybody else who worked in the field that they did would ever harm a child like that. And they really, it really took like a whole like changing in their worldview and the way of thinking, except for the few. And there was just a few kind of exceptional people like Dr. Copeland and some other people who went, nope, I know exactly what's going on here. I mean, this guy's a brand new doctor and he's like, somebody's killing this baby up here. One of you nurses or doctors is doing something and this baby's out. And and Rolando's grown up and he's got a family and he's got all this other stuff. And you can kind of see with Rolando, you can see like that future that's the future that was lost. That was what was lost with all these other children, these dozens of other children.
Well, all right, let's do a quick Q&A break. We'll be right back. Hey there, Beyond the Gavel fans. We've got some exciting news for you today. We now have a fantastic new feature called Fan Mail. This means that you can get even more involved with the show. Just click the Text the Judge link in the episode description box. With this feature, you can now send in your questions, your insights, and your reviews directly to us. Whether you have a question for the Q&A break, thoughts that you want to share, or just want to tell us how much you love the show, we want to hear from you. We'll be reading your messages during the break, so don't be shy. Text away and join the conversation. I can't wait to see what you have to say. Now let's hop back into today's Q&A break.
This is Q&A with Judge Ron Rangel. Submit your question today at beyondthegavelpodcast.com.
Welcome to the Q&A break. We have a question. Are judges allowed to speak to juries other than when they're in trial? Well, the answer obviously is yes. We're allowed to speak to juries, but we don't ever want to talk about anything related to the trial. And I'll give you an example. Let's say it's a break. I'm walking to go have some lunch. I'm walking to a meeting. It's the end of the day, whatever the situation is, and I happen to step into an elevator with another juror. Of course, we have the ability to make pleasantries like say hello, but anytime a judge speaks to a jury, it should always be only while that jury is in the courtroom and they're on the record. As a result of that, anything that is communicated between the two will always be documented. That's a very good question. Keep asking those questions. Remember to head over to beyondthegavelpodcast.com to send in any questions you have. You could also text the show by clicking Text the Judge and send in any questions that you might have at that particular time. Let's head back into the show.
This is Q&A with Judge Ron Rangel. Submit your question today at beyondthegavelpodcast.com.
Welcome back to the show. I'm here talking to Jason Goss. So at this time, then Genene had been in custody about 30 years.
33.
You guys are still trying to race against the clock. Case had been filed. It was filed in 399th District Court here in Bexar County with Judge Frank Castro, who's still on the bench.
Who's still on the bench.
And so now there is no statute of limitations when it comes to murder cases, right? So it doesn't matter how old the case is.
Right.
If the DA can present the evidence, can convince a grand jury, can take it to trial, can convince a trial jury, proof beyond a reasonable doubt that a murder occurred, you could try a murder case many, many years later.
Yeah.
Even though we know that there's challenges to that. Yeah. So what kind of pretrial issues did y'all deal with related to Genene's case?
Yeah, that's so the interesting thing is we get these indictments. The last one I think came in December 2017. Mm-hmm. And remember, March 2018 is her release date. And she actually did get released from prison. They released her. But they released her to the Bexar County Jail because by that time we had 5 indictments and Judge Castro had set $1 million on each. And so she got $5 million worth of bonds that she would have to come up with, which obviously she can't. Mm-hmm. So they released her from prison on the mandatory release, just like they had to.
And the Bexar County had that.
And the Bexar County had the hold on her. And then she came to Bexar County Jail. Yeah. One of the things that, because and this jumps ahead a little bit, but we ended up offering her to plead a life. Mm-hmm. And then, they said, well, you offered her plea to life. Why would she do it? And what I always thought was because it's got to be hard for her in the Bexar County Jail because you got 60 babies you killed in 1982, 1981, 1980. Well, those children all had families. Now, a lot of their family members grew up and they became great, wonderful members of our community. Mm-hmm. Some, had some issues. There are definitely relatives in that jail with her of babies that she killed. Mm-hmm. And they know it. That's part of their family history. They know that that's the person that killed their aunt, their niece, their, whoever. I thought, well, it's going to be uncomfortable for her in there because when you're in a prison, like, all right, you're just somebody. When you're in Bexar County and you've killed that many, mm-hmm. those families never forget. Okay. It's some of them are in that jail with you. Yeah. You know what I mean? You've got to be because I don't know any of those babies that didn't have like 4 or 5 brothers and sisters. You know what I mean? And like they all remember, they all know who killed their baby. Right. So I thought, well, that's what's going to make her plead. And, eventually I think it did work out that way and she did plead to life. But when we were initially coming up pretrial, one of the first things that Nico got asked in the press conference by somebody was like, is this just vengeance? And Nico said, no, it's making sure. Here's what we thought. Mm-hmm. We thought for sure that if she got released without any other case and any other thing, then she would go to Arizona, change her name, start working at a vacation Bible school, start working at a church and be in the nursery. Like nobody knows who she is. Like she would just kind of like she was 67 years old when we're doing this. I mean, that's 20 more years, that she could hurt. And for us, knowing her as we knew, she had kind of this, it's like a code blue feeling. It's like that adrenaline she would get with the code blues. I don't think she ever will ever get over that. I think that if you let her out right now, and I believe it today, I think if you let her out right now, she would figure out a way to hurt somebody to try to save them or to do that thing, to make herself look good. That's what our concern was. But, somebody from the media was like, are you just trying to, or this is just vengeance and why are you, but, Joshua Sawyer's mother didn't think that. Joshua Sawyer's mother said, no, this is 33 years too late for me. This is just finally justice is coming around to us. And Paul Villarreal's mother and sister, all of the people, Patrick Zabala's mother and father, I mean, they are all suffering. Rosemary Cantu, all suffering, just like it just happened yesterday. So one of the things that Genene's lawyers did was they said, well, this is a speedy trial issue. How can you, even if there's no statute of limitations, how can you 30 years later bring up a case that you make her answer for and that's not fair? And so this kind of leads to the second phase of our investigation, which got even better. It made the cases even better than when I indicted him, which was, and that's where Jay really comes in because Jay Norton is, he has so much experience that he was giving me and showing me and thinking about things in ways that I, as a prosecutor, at the time I was probably an 8-year lawyer. So I'd had an experience, mm-hmm. but, he's a 35-year lawyer and he was giving me stuff that I was just like, and I would have thought of. And one of the things was, he said, parole records. I want all of her parole records. And I was like, all right. So that was another 15 or 16 boxes. Because, people, when they say, we'll write letters to parole or whatever else. Well, so like Geraldo, I think in 88, and then I think Donahue and some other people had done episodes on Genene Jones back then. Mm-hmm. And at the end of the episode, they encourage everybody who's watching to write into the parole board. So we had boxes of people from the 80s who had watched those shows and actually wrote. And one of my favorites that we have a copy, my wife still has a copy on her wall, was a kid. I can't remember what his name was, but he said, hi, Texas Parole Board. My name is, Joe Smith, and I live in New Mexico, and I'm in 7th grade. And I just want you to know that nurse hurt all those babies. And that's just a horrible thing that she did. And I wanted to tell you that I'm saying, don't release that nurse. Don't release that nurse. So, it's just a kid writing a parole letter saying, don't release the nurse. We had parole letters from other inmates who were with her in the jail, who wrote to parole and said, do not parole this woman because she's got, all kinds of stuff. And that really was all Jay. Like Jay got that stuff. But the gold in there was she had these parole hearings and had talked to parole officers. Now, in your question was kind of about in talking about the pretrial stuff, mm-hmm. when they're alleging a speedy trial violation, one of the things we want to do is show, look, there is new evidence that they did not have back then.
That's how you overcome that.
That's right. Mm-hmm. And so what we found was there was a parole record that said Genene Jones talked to us and we asked her, about the offenses that she's been convicted of. And she said, I already told Mrs. Ferguson, 8 years ago, that, about this. And I don't know why you're asking me again. So we went back to 8 years ago, and that was like in 98. So this was like, 2006. And then we go back 8 years to 98, and we have this little notation from Marcy Ferguson that says she's confessed to these offenses that she's been convicted of. And she says that she did it and she was tearful, and she said she doesn't know what she was thinking, but that she did these things. So we were like, all right, we need to go talk to Marcy Ferguson. So we found her. She's been retired. She's, out somewhere. And we go out and find her, me and Jay and Larry DeHaven. And we go out to, we drive 3.5 hours, to where she lives. She's very nice. She brings us in the house and she tells us. She says, we show her her parole record, and she says, yes, that's what she said. But she said, there was something else. She said, I didn't put it in here because it wasn't about the offenses. But she said, we had our conversation, and she said what I said that she said. And then she got up and she walked to the door like she was going to leave and go back to her pod or whatever. Mm-hmm. And she said her hand was on the door, and she stopped and she turned around and she said, I want to tell you something else on the record. And Miss Ferguson said, okay, what would you like to talk about? And she said, she walked back to me and she said, I just want you to know I really did kill all those babies. And Miss Ferguson said she had the 2 files for Rolando Santos, who she was convicted of, and Chelsea McClellan, who she was convicted of. Mm-hmm. And she started looking, and she said, Genene said, you're not going to find them in there. Those aren't the ones I'm talking about. And she said the hairs stood up. She said, I remember it like it was yesterday. I remember every word she said. And then she said, and I better not see this in Texas Monthly, and turned around and walked out and slammed the door. So we had Marcy Ferguson say that. And what was important about that was, it's great if she confesses. I'm glad that, that she finally admitted to what she did to Rolando and to Chelsea. Mm-hmm. But when she said, I killed all those babies, there's only one baby in those 2 files that got killed. Rolando's still alive. When she said all those babies, that's all those babies.
I mean, is that something that's admissible in court?
Marcy Ferguson said, absolutely, 100%. She said it to me. So normally, it could be hearsay, except that the defendant's statement is an admission by a party opponent, or a statement by a party opponent. Mm-hmm. And so it would come down to the judge. I mean, it would come down to whether the judge believed Mrs. Ferguson, but anybody who talked to Mrs. Ferguson would believe her because she has no reason to lie about it. And I asked her, I said, well, why wouldn't you write it down there? And she said, well, it's one of those things that I remember it, but it wasn't part of this record. I'm making a record about what she has said and what we're doing about the cases that we're here for, not any other cases. And, those weren't in front of me. Mm-hmm. So in the official record, but she did get a certificate from parole because she finally got Genene Jones to confess. And so we had a certificate showing that they did acknowledge the fact that she had gotten that to happen. But she said, I probably would have written it down, but at the time I was just thinking, well, those are those offenses. And she kind of did it as an afterthought. She said, but I'll never forget it. I'll never forget that she said it in the way that she said it. And that little Texas Monthly thing is funny because Texas Monthly, Peter Elkind, who was writing for the Texas Monthly, did this huge article in the 80s, ended up writing a book about Genene. She wrote the book was called The Death Shift. It's a great book. Like, it lays out everything. And Peter's just such a good journalist. In fact, he's the first person I called when we started opening up the case, because I was like, I need to talk to you about some things. Peter ended up finding a nursing board. Genene Jones had written a letter to the nursing board saying, I just want to apologize to you for my heinous crimes and all my acts, because they are truly heinous. And, I don't know what I was going through, whatever. But we used that nursing board letter that Peter had found. We used Marcy Ferguson's statements. There was a inmate in the jail with her that had written to the parole board and said, you don't need to release her because she said that she killed all these babies, but she said it wasn't her that killed them. The voices in her head did. And so we had that letter, and we had these other things. And so we told the judge, we had a big hearing. Susan Reed, who was a former district attorney, was called, other people that had been involved. And then I testified to the new things. And Judge Castro ruled that, yes, there was new evidence that no prosecutor had, and therefore it should go forward. And
so that's why you brought in the former district attorney to testify that we didn't have this information about him.
Yeah, we didn't know any of that. And and so and then they, our appellate division and everybody did a really good job like setting that up. And then they had me last come in and go boom, 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 boom. And and it was pretty clear that like this was just different stuff. And so now we have these things. And like I said, we're glad that they didn't do it back then, because then she would have got all that time credit instead. Then she'd have been released on those.
So you get to the trial settings. There was an agreement that you fashioned and that you reached with the defense.
Well, so this is where it gets interesting, because as so 2017 is gone and we've indicted. 2018, March of 2018, Nico has a Democratic primary challenger, Mr. Gonzalez, who ends up winning the Democratic primary.
Who's our current DA now.
And is our current DA now.
So that happened in
March of 2020.
And so then Nico still was able to have that office till the end of that year.
Yes. So the parents, so by this time, the parents of these children have developed obviously very tight emotional bonds with us. We've all gone through the trenches and we've done it all together. So they are horrified that Nico lost. I mean, they're just, they think, oh my gosh,
what's going to happen to our case?
They don't know. And it's not that they thought that Mr. Gonzalez was going to be any terrible. It's just that they know who they know.
Right.
And it was going to be, it was terrifying to them. So I started I said, well, let's do what we can to try to get it tried before the end of this year, because we had until January of 2019. And then, and I knew that I was going to be going with Nico. I knew that I was going to be leaving the office. My wife ended up staying here, and she had actually ended up staying and kind of being involved in those cases, which I was glad that, they had somebody that they already knew, because my wife the whole time, I mean, she's a prosecutor and she was helping us. In fact, Ricky Nelson was a case that she found going through the records, because, if I'm going through them, she's going to go through them. And so she found Ricky Nelson and found all of those things. And for her, Ricky's just kind of, it's kind of her baby, because he didn't have his parents, because his parents had both died. So we were stressed, because I knew what I could do. I knew what we had done. I knew all the stuff. And of course I was going to help whoever came in, even though I wasn't here. I was going to help anybody, and I told the new prosecutors, and I'd offered anything that I could. And I actually did. I came in and gave them all the stuff that I'd done when we ended up leaving. But during that last year, it was kind of a race. And so, I would tell Cornelius, I'd say stuff like, I'd go, look, if you agree to try it, we won't get into these things. I was trying to limit the trial to a point where I knew that, it would be maybe a fairer fight for him, because the evidence for us was overwhelming. It was just a matter of when she was going to go.
So just to indict the cases, you were running up against a clock.
Yeah.
Now to try the cases, you have a different clock that's just as important, right?
Yes. And
in a lot of ways.
So it ended up coming to the end of the year, and I was like, and Judge Castro was game. He was like, if the parties are ready and everything else, but if you're a defense attorney confronted with a prosecutor that's gone, I've lived and breathed this case for the last 4 years, then they're going to go, no, thank you.
Yeah.
We'll try our luck with somebody else.
It's an adversary system.
Yeah,
right? Yeah,
exactly. And I would do the exact same thing. So he did the right thing.
Even though this case was indicted a few years ago, where capital murder capital punishment, the death penalty would be available to somebody. In Genene Jones's case, that is still not available because you got to go back to the law that applied at the time that the offenses were committed.
That's right. And parole law the same. So even on this new case, she's still under that old parole law. But ultimately, it was running out. And Joe was coming in. And I told the family, I said, look, anything I can do, I am not going to hinder this process at all. What we've all gone through to get here, I will, if I can hand off the baton and they get it across the finish line, that's the goal. Like, that's it. So they came in and he assigned it to Catherine Babbitt, who was my chief when I was here as a baby prosecutor. And I love and respect her. They assigned it to Gretchen Flater, who I worked with here in San Diego. And then my wife was also kind of, helping them with that. And so I came up with Sam DeMaio, and I gave her everything that I had, and I showed her, like, these are the main documents and these are the things, and this is my theory and everything else. And then they ended up taking it across the finish line, and they got her to plea to the life that I was trying to get her to plea to. But she did end up pleading, and the family was happy. The only, I guess the only bittersweet part of that was that Petty died. McClellan died before ever seeing her, pleaded that other case. But
how soon after the administration came in did that take place?
I think it was towards the end of 2019.
So almost a year later.
Yeah, it took them a while, because they had to learn it. They had to go through it, and they're going to make different decisions than I was going to make, and they're going to, have different things. But ultimately, I think it was good. It was fair to everybody, and then it got to the right result, and then Judge Castro got to admonish her, which I said, if I were a judge, that would be the one person I'd want sitting in front of me to be able to talk about, and he did. He told her what she took from everybody and just how horrifying it is, because, all of us got kids. And, and for me, what's interesting is that at the time when I was doing this case, I did not have children. As I was kind of getting ready and we were talking about maybe doing this, and I have a 2.5-year-old and I have a baby coming in September. And it's so different. And it was just taking me back. And, the emotions are just a lot different, because before, to be a good prosecutor, you have to have empathy.
Absolutely.
You have to be empathetic. You have to understand. I can tell somebody and I can feel what they're going through without ever having gone through what they went through. But once you have a child, and so I would just think about, oh my gosh, if I went to a nurse, how many times have I had my child in a doctor's office getting immunizations, and I trust that nurse to put those shots in and to do the things so I can get a school record to the thing. And if I had a nurse and watching my child try to say daddy and then not being able to say it, paralyzed and die in my arms, you just throw me in the grave too. You know what I mean? Like if something like that happens, and the strength and the fortitude of these families to go on from something so horrible, and to have somebody like Genene Jones, to just happen to come across their lives and change their lives forever.
Random happens.
Yeah. Right? And it's just, for me, it's just, having children just totally ups the ante of how much you felt. So Jay, he's had kids and they grew up, but Jay was reacting like that, and I didn't really even understand it like I do now, and kind of revisiting and thinking about that, about my own child, because you never know until you have one. And then when you have one, and it's like having your heart outside your chest, just walking around in and you're like, don't anybody ever hurt this baby.
It's always part of it, right? When it comes to punishment in the United States, somebody asked me today, hey, what do you think about punitive damages in criminal cases? And the response is the criminal law isn't really set up that way, because when somebody commits a crime, it's not just against that particular person. I mean, we have 60 people that you're talking about, children that were murdered, others injured. You have families that are involved. Apart from that, there is an entire community, there's an entire society that's affected by crime.
That's right.
And so those are things that need to be considered.
That's right.
As part of the calculus is what is an appropriate sentence, what is an appropriate punishment.
Sure.
Right. Well, Jason, I've really enjoyed this conversation. Any last words, any closing thoughts you'd have for our listeners?
No, just, I guess that, to me, what's interesting about this and everything else is I am just, for me, I'm just a person just like everybody else who watches forensic files and sees something and I was always thought, oh, well, that's always other people. It's not me. So, anybody out there, sometimes you'll see something like that and it'll touch your heart. And if you got the power to do it, then do it. because it's worth the work. And, once you get to the end of it, it doesn't have to be prosecution. It could be anything where you feel like I can make a difference in this. And I didn't really think about it. Do it, because it'll be rewarding and it's valuable, and it's valuable to all of us, and it'll help everybody. So yeah, always follow it. If you see something like that, watch it on a show or whatever else where you think you can do something. Do it.
Yeah, those are great words. Be kind to others.
Be kind to others.
Kind to others. Make a difference in the world.
Yeah.
Give it your all.
Sure.
Do your best.
Absolutely. I mean, and that's because you don't ever know where that road's going to lead you. But it turned out to be one of the most fulfilling things I ever did. Watching Forensic Files with my wife, and here we are. And I get to talk to Judge Ron Rangel about Genene Jones and what we did to get those babies justice.
Absolutely. My dad, Forensic Files was his favorite show.
Was it?
I never went to his house without him having that on the TV. So
yeah.
We got something in common there.
Yeah, no, that's great.
Well, Jason, thanks for coming in.
Sure. No,
I enjoyed talking to you. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for listening to Beyond the Gavel with Judge Ron Rangel. Remember, you can now text the show by clicking Text the Judge to send in your insights, your reviews, and your questions. I'll mention them during the break. We'll be back in 2 weeks.
You've been listening to Beyond the Gavel with Judge Ron Rangel. Join us in the next 2 weeks where we are educating the public and expanding mindsets. Head to our website, beyondthegavelpodcast.com, or your favorite podcast platform to subscribe to the latest episodes and updates.